Hi, everybody. This is Ginger. Today I'm here with Brad Barrett, the proper host of ChooseFI. Brad and I have obviously talked to each other a lot on the podcast, and if you're an avid listener, you know quite a few things about him already. You know that he likes roller coasters and board games and Taylor Swift. And you know that while he prioritizes time with his daughters and his health, there's nothing he loves more than Todoist. Hoping we can keep that in. Brad is a bit of a celebrity. I've seen it, how much people want to talk to him and how much people admire him. But of course, when we really admire someone, they start to seem like a different thing, like a different kind of human, one we can't really relate to, and one whose advice feels too strange because, again, different, not like me. So today my goal is to go a little deeper with Brad, to talk about personal finance, of course, but the parts we don't usually talk about, what's been hard and what keeps being hard. I hope it's a useful conversation to you all, and I'm really looking forward to it, and honored that Brad was open to such a chat. And with that, welcome to ChooseFI. Brad.
Ginger.
I know this is not the first time that you have been interviewed, but I wonder how it feels today after listening to my opening.
Yeah, that intro was incredible. And yeah, I love the word proper, the proper host. Listen, you're my co-host at this point, so we can call you the proper host as well. But yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the reasons why ChooseFI has been so popular, or at least I'd like to believe, is because I'm kind of relatable and I don't hold myself out as an expert, but I do know there is that kind of weird separation sometimes. And even though I try for it not to be there, and like you said, you've seen me at a live event, and it's an interesting thing that people come up to me and just want to tell me how important this podcast has been in their lives. And yeah, even so many years later. So we're recording this on basically like the 8th anniversary of ChooseFI. So 8 full years of doing this. And it has been the single most extraordinary thing of my life. Like I love doing this podcast, Ginger. Like I have come to that conclusion, especially over these last couple of months of my quote unquote mini retirement. And it just, on some level, it feels like it is my highest purpose on this earth. I just love doing this, and I can't describe it. I know over the last couple of years, I've been maybe complaining is a bit of an exaggeration, but I've been lamenting some of the frustrations with ChooseFI, and it's my own fault. I let it happen. I let some of it overrun my life, and responding to emails and feeling like I should do this and should do that, and I kind of lost sight of just how remarkable this is. And I'm vowing to you today to never lose sight of that again. I mean, I get to sit here with a $70 microphone and talk into it from this random little bedroom in Richmond, Virginia, and get to make a mark on the world. And I've spoken to millions of people, and like, it's an extraordinary thing. It's truly extraordinary. And yeah, I never want to lose sight of that. But I think hopefully people know, I think, and we'll maybe find out a little more today, that like, I'm just a regular guy. I mean, I'm just a regular suburban dad at this point, to two amazing daughters and just living a normal life. And that's actually one of the most interesting parts about this. It's like this bizarro universe where I'm like this Brad from ChooseFI, but then just regular old guy here in Richmond. It's interesting.
Yeah. I hear you when you say you've really made effort to share that you're like a normal person. And yet I think it is just this human thing where we start to feel, ultimately we start to objectify this other person, right? We make them into this thing that is so far removed from what a person is, and that there's nothing you can do about it, like you, the other person. And there's a way in which it's really hard for me, a listener, to do anything about it, right? Like, I think that's just a natural thing, when we hear someone that we admire. But I know I've shared this before, but one of the things that was really appealing to me when I started listening early on, right, and that's happening, and it was like, oh, it's fun to listen to these two guys, but it's not like what they're talking about has a lot of relevance to my life because they're just these two fun, interesting people who are very different. And you kept saying, you would say it over and over again. You would just say, like, we're just these ordinary people. And I remember it took like the 8th time you said that. And then when you said it, I actually heard you say it the 8th time. And that was when I really like went all in with ChooseFI, because then I was like, oh yeah, like I really got it, that this is like a normal person and I'm a normal person and I can do things like he has done things. And it, it reminds me so much of parenting, where it's like you have to say things 100 times and you just have to be okay with that. You just have to be like, hey, we pick up our toys at this time, and they just are not going to get it until the 100th time. And I feel like that's something the same about like adults are the same way, where the first times we hear things, we don't take it in the same way. And so I always appreciated that you reiterated over and over again, like we're not doing something extraordinary in a way, it's something that's available to other people.
Yeah. And I think it's so important, right? Nobody wants to hear from some world-class expert. Like it doesn't resonate. Like for me, and really my whole story has been a story of first of traditional FI and then entrepreneurship. But really all the entrepreneurship has been just like, hey, I'm a regular guy. I'm just maybe a step or two ahead. And I've spent a lot of time researching X, right? So it was like at first it was travel rewards and going to Disney World. And I knew there were millions of people like me out there who would want to do that. And like I can cut through the noise. Or like with ChooseFI, like what was so cool, I think, at the beginning with me and Jonathan is we really were so different, right? And like some people saw themselves in me, some people saw themselves in Jonathan. Undoubtedly, many people saw themselves in our guests who came on and told their story. And it was like, if you could just find that one person that was like you, maybe you could believe that you could do this too. Because, right, like at the end of the day, I don't think what we're doing, what we're doing ultimately leads to an extraordinary life, but I don't think it's like extraordinary inputs that get there. It's these small inputs. It's Ginger. We've talked about it so many times, right? It's the aggregation of marginal gains. It's these 1% changes that really add up to something extraordinary. And when you make dozens and then eventually hundreds of these 1% changes, your life is radically transformed. And you can't imagine a world where you hadn't made those changes. You hadn't learned or grown. You hadn't done any of these things. So yeah, and I do this. Listen, like I do this with Tim Ferriss is the one who I've listened to for years, over a decade now, and his book, The 4 Hour Work Week, transformed my life. But like I know from listening to him, he's just a regular guy. He's a regular guy from Long Island, New York, which I am too. And like he always talks about his problems and the things going on and things that he's working on and the challenges that he faces. And like I think that actually endears me to him in a sense that like he's not trying to stand up there as like I'm this infallible person. He's just a regular guy and he's trying to experiment to make his life better. And I think that's kind of the ethos that I've always taken with this is, hey, we're all just figuring this out. We're all figuring out life. We're all figuring out FI. We all do stupid things from time to time, whether for me it was this horrible land speculation in North Carolina way back in 2005 or freaking out when COVID hit and wondering if I should sell everything, even though I just spent the last 3 years of my life telling everybody, have an investor policy statement and don't do this and don't do that, right? Like your brain still goes crazy. It's still a lizard brain trying to keep you safe. And I think that's actually the good stuff, Ginger. That's not like, it doesn't mean I'm a fraud. It means I'm a human. And I think that's really important. And I think it's important for all of us to know, like, it's okay to be human. It's okay to make mistakes. Like, it's just about, as I like to say, it's about being directionally accurate. Like on a long enough timeline, on a 10, 20, 30, 50-year timeline, like, am I trying to live a better life? Am I getting better at life? Am I making the right decisions? Not every time, but over that 50-year time period, like that's the kind of game I'm playing.
Yeah. That reminds me of another moment that was really important to me. You had shared that you had like started some little business about fireplace, something,
Yep.
some accessory.
Yeah, firewood storage racks. Wow.
There it
good
is.
memory.
There it is. And you told it in like this bigger arc of like, hey, I've tried these little things, right? And that's me. And the way that I interpreted it for myself, right? Like I'm always like kind of trying a little thing and they don't go anywhere. And I always interpreted that as like, oh, you're kind of a loser. Like not that harshly, but like, oh, you can't get these things off the ground. There's something wrong with the fact that you're even trying, right? Because this is just like not the path for you. Like go do your normal job, right? But then when I heard it in your story, I felt really differently. I thought, oh, wait, I'm that kind of person. And that kind of person is like on a creative journey. And this is part of my creative journey. And so it gave me a lot of confidence in terms of like, of course, anyone who is successful now has these things that they've tried in the past that were not successful, right? And that is so obvious to say it now. But when you hear that from somebody who is where you want to be, it's so much more impactful. And so even now, like I feel emotional even saying that because it makes me think about how I view those things so differently now and how I view my own little projects that I do now. Like I don't think that whether they succeed or fail says something about my success as a human being. I think if it fails or it succeeds, it's both evidence for I'm this kind of person. And that's kind of an interesting person, right? Like I like that about myself. So
Yeah.
it was really powerful to me to hear you talk about a failure.
Yeah, and a lot of failures. Let's be clear, Ginger. There were a lot of failures. I mean, like I'm an overnight success, 10 years and 10 failures and probably more in the making. It's funny because yeah, you can look at people and say, "Oh wow, look at them." But yeah, if you could imagine me sitting there working on firewood-rack.net and like firepitmart and soccertools.com and thehousereference.com and all these ridiculous, horrible things. But I learned. And like you said, like I'm the type of person that dot, dot, dot. Like that's kind of a cool way to look at life is, you know what? Like I never looked at any of those as failures. They took a lot of time. And yeah, do I wish that they were successful? Do I wish that they brought in money? Yeah, I suppose so. Certainly at the time I did. But none of the good things that came after would have been possible without those failures. So were they really failures? Or was it just part of the process? Was it part of, hey, wow, I eventually built Travel Miles 101 and ChooseFI, which for a while, Travel Miles 101 was a real player in the travel reward space. And then I started ChooseFI and put all my attention there. And then obviously ChooseFI has become really the preeminent part of the FI community. And it's wild to see that. But you know, Ginger, I think like to me, this whole thing, and frankly, I don't know if I've ever been this explicit, but like the Trojan horse behind ChooseFI for me is like to get people to think more clearly. Like that's actually what I secretly hope in my heart of hearts comes out of listening to this podcast is like for you, the listener, whoever that is, like to just be able to like make slightly better decisions, to think through things more clearly. This is not about like the nuts and bolts of money. And I think that's why I've tried to learn as much as I can far and wide and bring that into the podcast and talk about decision making and talk about like how I think through things because it's not about the granular details. Like we can never go over. Undoubtedly, there have been millions of people that have listened to this podcast over the last 8 years. Like we're not going to dive into all 2 million of those scenarios. It's impossible. We have to talk in generalities, right? But if you are armed with that mental quiver, if you will, that enables you to think more clearly and make better decisions, I'm 100% confident that your life is going to be better. I can't foresee exactly what that means, but I'm 100% confident that your life is going to be better. And like, I think that to me, amidst the cacophony out there of like insanity in today's world and media ecosystem and horrible places like Twitter and all this other nonsense, like I hope that on some little way, like I'm making like a positive change in the world to help people maybe be a little less angry, maybe be a little less reactive, maybe have a little less stress or a lot less stress, frankly, right? Like if your financial situation is sorted out to a large degree, like a lot of that anger, a lot of that stress, it just melts away. Because what do you have to be angry about? Like everybody, they're always talking about like this elusive they, like, oh, they grumble, 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 the government, oh, the man, you know, like whatever. Like, yeah, I mean that in the proverbial sense. Like, you don't have to, like, I'm not worried about anybody right now. There's nobody that impacts my life. And that's a pretty cool feeling. And I think that to me is the goal of FI. It's that freedom, it's that autonomy, it's that reduction of stress. And I think that's the real thing that I hope people take away from it.
Yeah. Do you remember now? I know it's been a while, but do you remember when you first started thinking, like, I'm going to do this really differently and maybe quit my job way before anyone I know has done something? Like, how did you get there? Because I know that was quite a bit before you started ChooseFI, right? How did that come into your
Yeah.
brain?
Yeah.
And do you remember that process?
Yeah. It's all it's all muddled together in the sense that I was always a saver,
Mm-hmm.
but I never knew what the purpose was. So I was saving money. I had a decent net worth, but until I found the FI community, until I found Mr. Money Mustache, there was no FI community. Until I found Pete's blog,
Mm-hmm.
there was no purpose. Like I wasn't doing it for anything. I was just doing it because that's what I did, because I didn't spend money, because I was maybe too frugal,
Mm-hmm.
and I think like reading Pete's shockingly simple math behind early retirement article was just a total life changer for me. And that's why I tell everybody the starting point for FI is just get things down on paper, right? Like get down, hey, what does my life cost? What are my assets? What is my liabilities? And therefore, what's my net worth? And then you just take what does my life cost and multiply by 25. And like, yeah, can we argue about like safe withdrawal rates? And does it matter if it's 4% or 5% or 3.25? Like, honestly, Ginger, I don't care about that stuff at all. I genuinely don't. Like, that's for a platform outside of ChooseFI. Like,
Mm-hmm.
go to early retirement now and read Big Earn, Safe Withdrawal. Like, I don't bother myself with that stuff because I know how transformative it can be when you just find out, like, oh, there's some math behind this, right? Like, within reason, I just take what does my life cost times 25. Then it all makes sense. Like, it actually makes sense then. So that was a life changer for me. And then to your precise question, like, I would love to claim that I had some grand FI date in mind and I was going to ride off into the sunset. But I think I was a victim of one more year syndrome, or would have been a victim of one more year syndrome, because it's safe. Like my brain, I'm an anxious person. I've alluded to this a couple of times over the years. I am an anxious person. Hard stop, end of story. I always have been since I'm 5 years old. Like my mom pulled up something from like my kindergarten teacher, and like, I've been anxious for 40 years. It's me. So I suspect I would have just kept on going. But I think, again, armed with this knowledge that there's some number there, armed with the knowledge that, hey, yeah, I've tried and failed all of these entrepreneurial ventures, but wow, I just started something that actually works. And that was Richmond Savers and helping people go to Disney World with travel rewards points and credit card points. It was like, okay, like I'm well on my way to FI. Like my net worth, I'm not at 25 times, but I'm pretty close. I'm reasonably close. And what if I trusted myself? And I think that's what I did. And it's very far outside my comfort zone, Ginger, to do something kind of wacky and countercultural. And yeah, I mean, it's almost 10 years to the day from when we're recording this. So we're recording this January 8th, 2025. Basically 10 years ago was when I put in my notice at my job that I was leaving on January 31st, 2015. So yeah, I mean, it's literally a decade ago. And, I wasn't FI. I had a wife and 2 kids, and I was well on my path to FI, and I knew I had a lot of runway, but I bet on myself. And that took, if I can pat myself on the back, that took a lot of guts, and it was not easy. There were a lot of sleepless nights. That's part of my anxiety brain, and how it shows up is waking up in the middle of the night and just ruminating for hours and hours and hours and hours. So that definitely happened, but I did it. I pulled the trigger, and I started up that Travel Miles 101 site that very next day, literally the very next day, February 1st, 2015. And every good thing that happened in my life happened because I made that leap, and it wasn't easy, but it was really, really essential.
Yeah. Took a big risk.
Yeah.
Okay. How long has your household been retired? And by that, I mean you both had quit your W-2 jobs.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I left, obviously, as I said, January 31st, 2015. Laura was also a CPA, and she, by that time, was definitely not working full time. She still worked tax busy season as literally just a tax preparer virtually. So I think she did that for a handful more years, maybe even more. It was probably 2018 or 2019 when she
Mm-hmm.
stopped. I don't have the exact date. I could look it up on tax returns or something, but somewhere right in that vicinity. But she did it because she actually enjoyed it. I think there was some mental stimulation of keeping up with the business and keeping up with the industry and doing some stuff and frankly, like not being a full time stay at home mom, but in that case also being able to work and make some money, a nice bit of money for a couple of months a year. So it was like it was a really good thing for her. I think it was mentally rewarding for her.
Yeah. So the reason I ask about those dates is because I want to ask you a question that everyone
Yeah.
is curious about.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think everyone's curious about because I'm always curious to hear like people's stories of like they retire and then what happens with their money.
Yeah.
And so my question for you is since that date of like 2018 or whatever that was, have you pulled from your savings?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have not actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because that's probably why why you're curious is because I don't really talk about it that much, but I am in a fortunate position that these businesses that I put together do earn some income, and they earn enough income to cover my life expenses. So yeah, in this weird way, I have been, I guess, even though I didn't know it at the time, I was ChooseFI all this time, and maybe a little bit more because I was earning more money than I was able to save some money.
Mm-hmm.
So the net worth that I had in the background 10 years ago has just been compounding. And we all know how well the market's been doing since then. And I have been able to save some additional money. So yeah, I mean, my net worth has grown dramatically since then. I don't have the exact number, but I mean, it's many multiples, just again, by virtue of the stock market being absolute gangbusters over the last decade and being able to still contribute to it. So it's been amazing. But yeah, on some levels, I'm like, oh, I feel like I don't feel weird or I don't feel guilty. That's not but it's just like, it's hard to talk about, because I'm not like the stereotypical FI. But then my mind immediately pivots to, but come on, man, nobody's the stereotypical FI. Like, that's actually the fun part about FI is like, I know fleetingly few people who just retire on X day and then the very next day they make $0 for the rest of their lives. Like, I can think of almost zero people that have done that. So I shouldn't feel guilty, but like on some level, it would actually be more interesting as a story, right? To be able to tell everybody like, hey, this is in granular detail what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm just not in that spot. So that's why, I bring on people to talk about it. Bring on people like Fritz from Retirement Manifesto to talk about his bucket strategy or whatever, because someday I'm going to have to do that. Obviously, like ChooseFI is not going to be around forever. I'm not going to be making money from ChooseFI forever. So it's coming. And I need to learn about it for sure.
Yeah. I asked that question because I'm curious, but also because I have heard that so much from people in the space where they have this plan. And I know this isn't exactly what you're saying, but they have this plan about what it's going to look like. And then what you hear from them 3 years later is actually, I haven't pulled from any of those accounts.
Right.
And so
Right.
I wonder, do you chalk that up more to, hey, my businesses have taken off or been really successful, or more to we've really worked hard to keep our expenses down, and maybe there's a balance of those things?
Yeah. Yeah. That is an interesting question. So in my particular case, it's definitely that the businesses have made enough to cover our expenses. And I mean, honestly, and I've talked about this a lot over the last couple of years, is I've gotten much less frugal over the last handful of years. And I think probably less than that if I'm fair. But certainly the last 2 or 3 years. And it's not like we're going wild with spending. I mean, I'm not making that kind of money, let's be clear. But I think when you have outsized market returns and you have some money coming in, you realize I think my tendency is to be too conservative with money at the expense of living a great life.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest positive changes that I've made in my life is to loosen the purse strings a little bit over the last couple of years and just realize that life is finite and being frugal, I think, has a massive purpose generally. And certainly at the beginning of your FI journey. There is no two ways about it. And that's part of my fear about talking about this sometimes, Ginger, honestly, is like, because now I'm spending more and I'm going to Taylor Swift concerts in London with my daughters or going on these roller coaster trips, albeit I'm still doing them very frugally. I'm still using Hyatt points when Anna and I go, like we have our own routine in our Hyatt places or Hyatt houses. And we use rewards points to try, like, but still it costs money. Let's be perfectly clear. But those are life experiences we're never regret. There is no world where I'm going to look back 50 years from now on my deathbed and say, oh, I shouldn't have taken Anna to Texas for 4 days to go to 3 different amusement parks because it cost us a couple $100. Like, there is no world. The only world will be, wow, I wish I did 5 times that number, But again, that's like, it's not to say that frugality doesn't have its place, because I think if that's the message that comes across or has come across for me the last couple of years, like that's a deep regret of mine, because frugality is really important. And just being a valuist, which is what I've always termed myself, is like, I don't just spend freely, I spend on what I value. And I think that reframe kind of helped me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know if I necessarily answered your question fully, but yeah, I'm definitely, I guess that's kind of where I am. But if you have any follow-ups, let me know.
Well, I like how you talked about it there. It's a shift that I've had in my thinking around, we think a lot about, hey, if I don't save enough, there's a real risk that I could run out of money, right? Or that I could have some real problems as I get older. But there's also a real risk of wasting your life. And that part we don't talk about, or we don't think about in the same way. There's some way where we don't think about how not making those memories, like there is a risk, right? Because we are going to run out of time. And so it is an important kind of work. I know what you're saying. You don't want the frugal piece to get pushed out because it's so, hey, you know what? We really need to not run out of money.
Yeah.
But we all know that already. That's all over our culture, and we know that part. But this other part about, I'm not going to get my 40s back. I'm not going to get this time of my child's life back, right? And I am at risk of wasting it if I am focusing too much on making sure some number reaches some magic goalpost.
Yeah. And, I think the one non-renewable resource is our time and our lives. And yeah, you just can't waste it. You can't wish it away for another day.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us who maybe are predisposed to delayed gratification might do that a little bit too much, where we push it off, we push it off, we push it off. But if you combine delayed gratification with a little bit too conservative, with a little bit of one more year syndrome, you wake up and you're 60 and you didn't do all those things. You can't get back your 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it's not to say, obviously, by no means is life over at 60. I'm not arguing that at all. You still have plenty of good years. But pick any age and then take the prior 20 years. If you just wished it away just to get some number on a spreadsheet, like that's not a recipe for a happy life. It's not a recipe for a successful life. It just isn't, regardless of what your net worth is. Your net worth will never make you happy. It'll make your life better, but it will never, ever, ever make your life happy. It's just not the way we're wired. It really isn't.
So is it fair, having gotten that background now from you, to say, like, do you feel like you have been early retired for a decade? I know you've been busy and I know you've been working on things, but is that how you think about your life?
Yeah, I do. I do. But again, with the caveat of like, I overthink things and I don't want to like ever portray myself in the wrong light. So Ginger, I know that I overthink. That's like, again, this is something I've been dealing with for a very, very long time. So I think, yeah, if I'm completely frank, I do consider myself early retired, even though by any definition I do work. But this is a passion project. Like if ChooseFI made $0 tomorrow, I would still do this podcast. There's no world where I would stop this podcast. There's no world. I just love it. So I think we're all going to have passion projects once we reach FI, or once we leave our corporate job, or whatever, however you want to term it. And I think, as Pete, Mr. Money Mustache, used to like to joke, it's like the internet retirement police. These jerks who come around and are like, oh, but you're making money, so you're not actually FI, or you're not actually early retired. And it's like, why these people feel the need to disparage anybody that they don't know for no particular reason. It's just, yeah, it's so beyond me. Like, people are going to earn money. They are. People are going to do projects. They are. That's just that. We're the most, like, if you go to any FI event, you're going to find the most interesting, creative people, driven people that you've ever met in your entire life. Like, this is what's fun about meeting FI people. Like, we're super interesting and it's awesome. So to imagine that somebody's going to sit around doing nothing, as your definition of early retired, sitting around watching sports for 12 hours a day on TV, like, nobody's aspiring to that. That's ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, Ginger, I think by any definition, I control my time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the only thing that matters. And I'm taking much more control of that time now. And I think that mini retirement that I went on really, really helped a lot.
Mm. So we know a lot of the good things that have come from your life because you've reached financial independence, right? Like you've talked a lot about what it means to be able to do work that you want to do, to be able to travel when you want to travel. A lot of things that seem really appealing. Like, yes, I want it. Let's do it. If you think about the last 10 years, what has been harder than you expected it to be?
Yeah. So the harder things, I guess, I guess a couple of things. So, first, while I never liked working by any means.
Mm-hmm.
I think what most people do like about their jobs are their coworkers and having this built-in camaraderie. And I really did enjoy my coworkers at my old job. And I didn't do a great job of keeping up with them after I left. And you lose that built-in camaraderie that's there. And yeah, I think more than that is I didn't do a great job of trying to build a community here in Richmond or trying to build like real friendships.
Hmm.
So I think I was probably lonely for a while. I think yeah, I think that clearly happened. I think also you have to figure out what works for you and your life situation. And I think we thought at first, like me being home would be this like amazing thing. Like I get to be home with the girls when they're there and when they're not, before they went to school. And I'm there with my wife, Laura. But I think there's a way to fall into bad habits. And not that I'm advocating working in a job by any means, but I think I didn't establish like a better work life balance in the sense that like it felt like any time I was getting with all three of them was like kind of grazing time. It was always like I would see Laura 10 times a day and it would just be like these quick hits like, hey, how are you doing? What have you been up to? And it was just these like meaningless conversations, even though by any measure, like we were spending a lot of time together.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like real quality time. It was all these just like drive-by things. And like my daughters saw me because I didn't establish boundaries. And I think boundaries are really important, especially when you have your own business. It's so easy to do more. Like I could work, if I wanted to, I could work 24 hours a day, every day for the rest of my life on ChooseFI if I was so inclined. And I think I'm a lot better with it now. But for years there, I would just kind of graze on up, mosey on up to my office and quote unquote check email. Like if you could ask my daughters, like how many times daddy went and checked email and then was just vanished for 30 minutes or an hour or something. And it's like, so yeah, I don't think I did a great job with that.
That has to be so common because the main thing that work gives us is structure.
Yeah.
And that influences kind of every part of our day, right? It influences how we direct our psychic energy, but it also, like, you're getting at something important that people aren't thinking about, which is the coming back together with the family and how leaving the family influences the coming back together as a family and influences that quality of time that you have. And so without those sort of built-in routines, I could see how it could be, in fact, kind of distressing for people,
Yeah.
to figure that part out because we don't usually think about it.
No, we don't. We don't. And I think the key takeaway for me was intentionality, or should have been, or is for everybody else, is I think in all aspects of your life, like you said, setting up these boundaries, setting up a structure is really what you were talking about. Is I think it's all part and parcel of being intentional. And when you aren't intentional, it's easy to fall into bad habits, no matter what they may be. And it's funny because so many of my friends in the FI community who have reached FI and then went and traveled, right? Like quote unquote, like I'm going to go travel the world. They almost invariably come back to some type of structure, however they define that. So I know like Alan and Katie Donegan and I talked at length on our travels to Asia a couple of months ago, and they've been nomadic now for 5 years. And they're at the point where they're contemplating like, hey, what would it look like to have maybe 3 or 4 home bases each year where we spend 3 or 4 months each year, because they want a structure. They want to have the same, some friends who they knew maybe from last year who are still there. They want a gym to go to and their routine and a kitchen to cook in and be able to buy groceries for months at a time as opposed to just grazing. And I think that intentionality is really important. So I think that's something that in all candor, I really screwed up on. And I think, I just don't think it was ideal.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting thing to talk about because freedom, when you're talking about the Donegans, that is also freedom, like to be able to put that structure. And so often we think of freedom more like no structure, but chaos isn't exactly the path that we want to go.
Right.
Either. Okay. So structure was a tricky thing to figure out. I want us to move closer to the present moment.
Yeah.
Although it's interesting to hear about what were those struggles early on. And I know we had talked about a big thing that's happening in your life. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted to have this conversation was so that you could share a little bit about something hard that's happening now.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is not easy to talk about. But yeah, my wife and I are separated, and we are in the final stages of finalizing a divorce, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it is really not easy to talk about, Ginger, because I have been chronicling my life for 8 years, and there's part of me that wants to talk about this, and there's obviously part of me that says ultimately it's nobody's business. It's a very personal thing, and unfortunately in life people drift apart sometimes, and things happen, and that's just the reality of life. And there's obviously, so I'm of it's hard. I think it's hard, and I didn't want to not talk about it. I think is the biggest thing, because I feel like the people who listen to the show are coming here in a large part because they feel like maybe I'm their friend in some weird way, and I didn't want to hide something, but I also know, frankly, that I have very thin skin, and I know how my friend Pete, Mr. Money Mustache, just for no reason whatsoever, got attacked years ago when he announced that he was getting divorced. And I think, like, to me, the thing that, like, I'm most worried about, as weird as this sounds, like, obviously I'm most worried about the impact on my children, let's be clear. But in terms of this podcast, is like, again, these just ultimately trolls and jerks just coming and like attacking Fi because my marriage happened to not work out, right? Like, just because my wife and I grew apart, like, nothing terrible happened, nothing bad happened from Fi, and like, not even remotely, but like somehow people using it as like a cudgel to attack Fi because, oh, look at this guy Brad who's been talking about what a great life he's had, and he's getting a divorce like that. I know it's weird, Ginger, but like, I've devoted so much of my life to the Fi community, and I feel so strongly about it, and like, it tears me up to think that people might attack Fi because my marriage happened to not work out. And
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, this is part of that objectification, right?
Yeah.
About we have this idea about who you are, and it's hard for people to hear that you're a person.
Yeah. Yeah. And we are just people. We are just people.
Yeah. And of course, sort of like money, like we talk about how retiring early kind of influences every part of your life, like so does the structure of your family. And so I appreciate that you're saying, this is like so private, and yet it's also so big.
Yeah.
Right? That it's changing every part of your life right now.
Yeah, it really is. I think the things going on in my life generally over the last 8 years are things that I talk about on the podcast, because if I'm going through it, undoubtedly there are many tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are going through something similar. And because I am a very private person, and I, I'm not going to go into every last detail, but things that I'll be dealing with, splitting up assets, splitting up businesses, which is really complex. Like,
Yeah.
dealing with all this stuff, like, undoubtedly it will influence the podcast in some way, but there's no world where I'm going to come on here and just like bare my soul about, every last little detail. Like that's not, nobody needs that. It's not practical. It's nobody's business again. But if I can help people, that's always what I've wanted to do, is if I can help people in some way, I want to do that. And if that means bringing on, I met some attorney last year at Economy who spoke on the main stage about prenuptial agreements and things like that, and splitting assets. Like he might be somebody that I get on and would be interesting to talk to. And it's just, this is an aspect of the financial life that is really important to a lot of people. Clearly, it's very important. And frankly, in almost 700 episodes of ChooseFI, we've never talked about it. So like, that will have to change. I think it should have changed prior to this, totally irrelevant of my life. But yeah, so I mean, I'm going to talk about it in some way. But yeah, I just again, it's like my own fear, Ginger. But like, I'm like, I know in my heart of hearts that if there are people who are listening to this or hear this and like want to vilify me or attack me, like it says way more about them and like what, the pathetic state of their soul and brain than about me, but nevertheless, like I don't want to log onto Facebook and see people like attack me in my group or get emails like, oh, you're a fraud because you got divorced. Like, give me a break. I'm not a fraud. Fi's not a fraud. Like it just, life happens sometimes against your best laid plans. And I think, like we talked about before, with, time is your one non-renewable resource. And I think it's important to also pick up your life and move forward positively. And I think, luckily, FI has afforded me and us the ability to do that. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to be destitute when this all shakes down. It's not going to be, the perfect financial situation, but I'm not going to be destitute by any stretch. And I think I have the ability to move forward and try to live, the best life that I possibly can. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, right? And I think that aspect is a good thing. And yeah, it's just, life is short, and it's to wish any amount of it away is just kind of silly. So I'm just trying to pick back up and live the best life I can.
Yeah. What have been the parts of this process that have surprised you?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, it's not surprising that it's stressful. It's obviously stressful. I think there's just so many details to figure out, especially when you have kids in the mix, especially when you are trying to figure out co-parenting and how the exact timeline is going to work. And also, like, we're very cognizant of our kids' mental well-being. And while there's something you could put on paper, like, this is how we're going to split custody, but when the rubber hits the road and the kids feel really comfortable in one spot, like, it's hard to force them to sleep in somebody, in another place or something like that. Like, I think one of the best parts about us has always been, like, we don't get caught up in the normal cultural things of like,
you should do this,
you have to do this, or like, because it's Thanksgiving, you need to do X with this family. And like, or July 4th, like the funny example is like July 4th. It's like a big party at our summer pool. And it's like, everybody goes, they line up like hours early to go in. And it's just like a madhouse and it's horrible. Like, we would go to the pool every other day of the year other than July 4th, because like in our minds, we're not sheep who like just do what everybody else does. And, I think that is probably going to help us through this process, but it does add some complications, obviously. And yeah, I mean, I think just finally is anytime you have to split up a fairly complex financial life, it's not super simple. So trying to figure all that kind of stuff out is it's just details. At the end of the day, it's all just details. It's all going to work out fine. It's just, and obviously I don't wish that I had $0 of net worth, right? Or didn't have rental properties or didn't have a business or whatever, but it adds complexity to it. So I think that's maybe what's slightly harder than I would have expected.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's a stressful time. Of course it is. Has money or the money issues, have they been stressful?
I mean, yes and no, ultimately. I think no, in the sense that I think, again, we are FI by any definition on paper, and money is still coming in from my businesses. Mm-hmm. So the stress has just been like, okay, look, like, I'm having to split up one financial life into two. So it's just been like more details. Like, I've been trying to proactively set up new accounts, new checking accounts, new things that aren't joint. right? And just try to, then you move all your auto pays and all your other things, right? It's like all these little details. So it's just been a lot of work, but I wouldn't say that aspect has been stressful. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, just, again, the final details of how things get sorted out, like that's never going to be perfectly straightforward unless you just had a checking account with X number of dollars in and you just divide by two, right?
Yeah. I think to kind of pull back and ask a more general question, I think something that people think about when they are developing their FI number is that if they are coupled, they're thinking about what that number is for the couple. And that might look, I think it necessarily looks really different if it's two single people. And so, I've heard of people like, how do you factor that in when you're thinking about something that might happen in 20 years,
Yeah.
right? Like we
Yeah.
all want to believe that our lives will be the same, but often, many, many times they aren't. So I guess for you, it sounds like you're saying it hasn't stressed you out in terms of like, hey, now we're not going to be able to make it. Now we're not going to be okay. It sounds like you're okay. But how would you advise people to sort of think about this as they're thinking about financial independence?
Whew. Yeah, Ginger, that is tough. I think I'd need to think more deeply to give a better answer because I haven't thought about that overtly.
And maybe there isn't really a good answer to that
Yeah.
question.
No, because well, yeah, because I wonder, right, like, does it just lead to not one more year syndrome, but 10 more year syndrome, right? Like, hey, are we 50x FI because 50x our expenses because what happens if things go bad? Yeah, but you can't stick your head in the sand. I'm arguing both sides of this, so bear with me. Like, you can't stick your head in the sand, of course, and say, obviously, you look at divorce rates and know that this is very realistic for a lot of people. So
Mhm.
it's not out of the blue if somebody in our community gets divorced, right? Like, it's invariably going to happen to 20, 30, 50% of people. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily advise like over saving for something that you don't know what the likelihood of it is. So it's kind of a quandary or an impasse. I don't know exactly how to think about that. I think at the end of the day, like, I think I can only really give my own thoughts on where I am now, which is, it's interesting when I look at my financial life, and I've long talked about being like a minimalist and, not really spending that much money in the scheme of things. And I actually look at my own financial life now, which will be going forward separately. And I actually don't spend that much money. I
Mhm.
really don't. I spend on rent. I spend a couple $100 a month on food. I have a personal trainer and a gym membership, which is not that much in the scheme of things. And honestly, Ginger, there's not much more. Obviously, I'll have my own health insurance and, of course, all the normal insurances and things like that. But I live a pretty good life, I think, and I don't spend that much money. And I have a lot of travel rewards points, and I'm going to travel a good bit. And we know that isn't terribly expensive from friends of ours like Chrissy and Bryce from Millennial Revolution. Like, they spend $30,000 a year on travel, and I know the Donegans can spend somewhere in that vicinity. I know they've loosened the purse strings recently, also. But yeah, I mean, that's been an interesting realization for me. It's like my life actually costs less than I thought that it would. So I don't know that there's much of a takeaway there, but nevertheless, that has been interesting.
Yeah. When you mentioned insurance, it made me think, I wonder if there are other expenses that people don't think about. Like, obviously, housing is the big one I think about right away, and insurance is a big one. Are there other things that when you split become more expensive?
Mm. Oh, that's a good question. I have not seen it to date, but I mean, I think just by virtue, right, of having two locations, right, then you have double the internet costs, you have double the utilities, all that stuff, right? Like, you don't think about that. You have
Yeah.
double insurance now, especially if you're getting two comparable places, right? So I'm in a townhouse, so it's rented. I'm actually renting now, so I think, interestingly, I don't know that I'll ever, and it's way too early to say never, but as of right now, I don't think I'll ever own my primary residence ever again.
What?
I love renting. I have always loved the concept of renting. I would never, ever, ever own my primary residence. Yeah, I think ever. That's probably a whole extra hour episode. Maybe we can
I
uh, we can
know.
do another time.
I want you to say a little bit more about that, though, because you put so many never evers in front of that.
Oh, I mean, never ever. I mean, just from the financial aspect, I love renting. It's
Yeah.
incredible. It just costs nothing other than this is the money that I send over every month via bank transfer. And anything that pops up, like you don't realize, like, and this is not to say that real estate is a bad investment. I think people conflate the two. Like, there's this like cult of home ownership, but that's very different from like having rental properties that are an actual business, like totally separate issue. I'm not arguing that at all. I think most people, if they're completely honest with themselves, of which almost nobody ever is, owning your own primary residence is not an investment at all. It's a terrible investment at best because you don't think of all the things, the money they're the money pits. They're total money pits. Like I think of just random things that like the sprinkler system that we turn on and off for $200 a year because you have to keep your lawn nice, so you get fertilizing and just all these stupid things. Not to mention all the things that break, and you don't think like, oh, I just spent $10,000 on an HVAC unit that has a 10-year useful life. I'm just making this up. So that's $1,000 a year. That's $80 a month, essentially. Like you don't think of that as a cost in your mortgage, but like every single thing in your house has a useful life. From the roof that's going to cost you $20,000 to $50,000 on down, you should really, like my accountant speak, you should really amortize that across every single month and realize like that's how much your house costs because you have to replace every single one of those damn things. And things break all the time. Refrigerators break, hot water heaters break. Like when you actually add it all up, and then the real estate taxes, like it all just adds up to this crazy number, I mean, it's wild. Like it is very, very, very expensive. So yeah, I mean, just the flexibility of being able to rent, the lower cost, and then not to mention the biggest thing that most people don't realize is the opportunity cost, right? So let's say you have a house that now is worth, it's just gone up, right? Gone up a ton. Maybe you bought it for $200,000 and now it's worth 500,000. Like that's not unrealistic for a lot of our listeners. And maybe you paid down the mortgage. Maybe you only owe 100 grand on that mortgage. The house is worth 500. Okay. So you have $400,000 of equity, which is wonderful, but that's just sitting there inert doing nothing, right? As opposed to had you had that $400 and invested in the stock market, well, damn, over the last couple of years, that almost undoubtedly would have doubled, right? But even putting that aside, if you assume that you get 8% annual return on that, it's not every year, of course, but this past year would have been over 20%. Some years it's negative, but most years it's pretty darn good. 8% of that 400 is $32,000 a year, right? Like, I mean, that's almost $3,000 a month that is just sitting there in those walls. Whereas if you had that 400,000 and invested it, you could have pulled that 30 and that would have covered a rent payment in my case. So I think a lot of people don't factor that in as a cost when they think about their primary residence is the equity just sitting there inert. So I think almost invariably your primary residence is a terrible investment if we'd even call it that. But nevertheless, I like the flexibility. I like if anything breaks, I just make a phone call and they show up and I don't have to pay $1. It's amazing. It's really amazing.
Yeah. You mentioned before that you found yourself becoming more and more of a minimalist, and you hear that a lot in this community, and I am certainly also lean that way. And I've wondered if part of that is by the time that you are our age, you have a couple decades to sort of look back and say, what do I regret spending money on? And what am I happy I spent money on? And I think for most of us, it's like you were saying before, I'm not going to regret having taken this trip with my daughters. And I think the same way, right? Like, oh, I had these experiences. They're over, but they're important to me now. Whereas I do regret things that I bought that did not have long lasting value to me. And yet, like, even though that is totally me and more is me, oh my gosh, my house though. I think I'm so sentimental.
Yeah.
When I hear you talk about this freedom that comes from not being connected to the chains of home ownership, that sounds really appealing. But oh my gosh, I have such a attachment to my house.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, I totally, totally hear you. Yeah, there's no right answer. And again, because people sometimes misconstrue things, I'm not saying owning your home is a terrible idea. Quite the contrary. I've owned a home since 2005 for 20 years because psychologically it made sense. For our daughters, it made sense. For stability, it made sense. but I don't think for 1 second that it was a financial investment. It was,
Yeah.
I spent money on living there, and even quote unquote owning your home is like a silly misnomer anyway. People always say, "Oh, you're throwing money away to rent." Well, take a look at your mortgage statement next time. Look at the amortization and look at how much of what percentage of your payment every month is going towards interest. You will be shocked at how high it
Yeah.
is. So let's be entirely clear. That is rent in another name. So yeah, there's that. But going back to minimalism is, yeah, I mean, I think for me, and again, it's not to say that this is the right answer. There's no right answer. Everything is about yourself. But like, I am more minimalist now than I've ever been. I mean, even to the point of like, I've gotten my life down to if I needed to leave this place right now, I could put just about everything I have into one suitcase and I'd be perfectly fine.
Awesome.
And yeah, it's cool. And like, maybe I'm taking it a little too far. I'm like, I have this bookshelf that I'm looking here. I'm thinking about offering this up to the Richmond local group of just like, hey, I'm going to bring all of my books to the next meetup and anybody can grab any book they want. Like I have this shelf that I don't even know why I have these books. Like I'm not going to reread any of them. They're just like these little trophies in some bizarro sense. Like, do I
Yeah.
really need this? So like I'm kind of questioning everything now. And it's not to sit here like a miser and just like sit and stare at blank walls. So I am cognizant of like maybe overdoing it. But there is something kind of cool and liberating about saying like, I'm not tied down to stuff. And that's not to say when I move somewhere, or, if I move somewhere that I'm not going to need to buy stuff because frankly I will. But there's something in my mind that's like, oh, it'd be cool if I just had a list of the things that I would need to rebuy. Like if I didn't even want to store this stuff, or if let's say I went and traveled someday, my kids are off in college and I have some freedom and I can do what I want. Like, am I going to store this queen size bed that I have here? Am I going to store these blankets like a cost, and my books and my kitchen stuff? Or should I just rebuy the darn stuff? Like I know that sounds kind of crazy, but like this is where my mind is going. It's like, wouldn't it be cool to just be liberated and just say like, hey, these are the 50 things I would need to buy when I move to a new place, and maybe I just think about rebuying them. I know this is kind of a weird off the wall brainstorm, but it's been kind of fun just realizing like how little I need to live a really good life. And I think that's really the takeaway. It's been energizing. And then I look at my closet all the time. I'm like, you could do that thing where like, hey, I haven't worn this in a year. Am I really ever going to wear it? Or is it time to donate this to somebody who actually is? And you know what? If I ever needed that sweater or need a sweater, like I could just go buy another sweater sometime. Like I haven't worn a sweater here in Richmond in 15 years. Do I really need these things? Like I really, really don't. So yeah, it's been kind of a fun intellectual exercise in that regard.
Yeah. When I hear you saying like, oh, I could just buy new sheets, I could buy new blanket, like I feel like this openness in my chest of like, oh yes, freedom. Like that is so appealing to me to not be attached to any of your things. I think that is so incredible. And yet, when I said I'm really attached to my house, I saw an understanding in your eyes that you get that. And I wondered, like, to go back to your life, if we just put the difficulty of the changing relationships on hold and put that to the side, was there something hard about leaving the family home? Like, were you attached to that place?
Yeah, that's interesting. So right, obviously putting aside the relationships, like you said. So let anybody who's listening be clear that we're not talking about that at all. So totally putting that aside. The actual location, no. Like, and I think it kind of ties to what I've said for a long time is like, I don't get psychological satisfaction from owning a home or owning a car or any kind of stuff. Like it's just not my thing. It really isn't. So, I mean, were there aspects of the house that I love? Yeah, of course there were, right? Like, did I really enjoy having the hot tub downstairs that I could go in all the time? Yeah, it was, it was cool. But is there anything that like realistically I would like desperately miss? No, and I think it speaks to maybe more like practicality of it. Like this is maybe that like maximizer versus satisficer thing that I've talked about a couple of times. It's like this psychological thing of and satisficer is kind of a weird word. So it's not satisfier, it's satisficer, and it's basically like people who are maximizers look to like get every last little drop out of something, and it has to be the perfect answer. And they're going to always stress about, did I make the right decision? Did I not? And like the satisficer basically finds something that's good enough and just makes a decision and then never regrets all those other options of what could have been. And I think I'm very much a satisficer in the sense that I know that was one of 10,000 homes just in the Richmond area, or probably more than that, that we would have been content with. So it wasn't like I had some deep-seated, like, this is the home. I think the home is, for me, the memories of my daughters growing up and doing fun things and that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of agnostic to like the actual building. Like, that's just the way my brain works. Is like, I'm just not tied to buildings. I'm not tied to stuff. I'm not tied to cars. I'm not tied to anything, frankly. And I don't know. To me, that feels like kind of liberating. Like, I know it could possibly sound callous to somebody's ears who's like, maybe they think opposite, but that's the beauty of life, is we all think differently, right? Like, to me, it's not callous at all. It's focusing on the important stuff, not the structure that I happen to reside in.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful because we got to hear how other people think about it. Like, it helps us when we need to change how we think about it.
Yeah.
And this conversation makes me think of the conversation that I had with Anne from Alaska. And we talked a lot about leaving her family home, right, where she had raised her children after 30 years. And to me, that was such an emotional thing to explore. I mean, I wanted to talk to her about it because it seemed really hard. And she said something so smart that I think about all the time, where she says, okay, I was giving up the house, but I wasn't giving up the memories in the house.
Yeah.
And I think about, when I think about leaving our house, I think, oh gosh, how could I ever leave this image of my child being 3 in the raspberry bushes, right? And yet Anna's saying, well, you don't have that now. He's not 3 anymore.
Right.
You already don't have that. So the thing that you take forward with you, right, that memory, those you get to keep.
Yeah.
And just that framing of it helps me to calm down about like some of my attachment to things and to places. Because when you really look at like, what is it that's so terrible about leaving this? And it's about leaving the memory of the experience, right? And you even hit on that when you were like, okay, well, what's special about this house? It's the memories that I have with my daughter.
Yeah.
And you get to have those no matter where you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Totally agreed.
So as we're kind of wrapping it up, I'm thinking about something that you said before we started recording, where I was kind of asking you some details about what was happening. And you were so honest about like, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know everything about this process. I don't know everything that it's going to require, right? And so I think maybe it would be wise of us to end not on a tidied little wrapped closing, but to say, hey, this is part of the journey. And I really appreciate you being willing to talk about it. And I know it's helpful for other people to hear about that journey as well.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And let's talk soon.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds good. And Ginger, thank you. Thank you for interviewing me. This is, I think, a cool idea generally. And thank you for helping me and just being there. This was not an easy one for me by any means, but I think it was important. So yeah, thank you sincerely.